With the release of The Death of Robin Hood approaching, a lot of discussion surrounding this film has been focused around one word: reimagining. Critics, reviewers, and even the marketing material have repeatedly described the movie as a new take on the legendary outlaw. And I think that's just flat out wrong. You see, at first glance, the film appears radically different from the Robin Hood most modern audiences know. This Robin is older, he's wounded, he's haunted by his past. Early reviews suggest he openly rejects many of the heroic myths that have grown around his name. Instead of a noble freedom fighter, he's portrayed as a violent outlaw, forced to confront the consequences of his life and the legend that followed him. See, that sounds like a reimagining only if your understanding of Robin Hood begins with the version that dominated the 20th century. What makes The Death of Robin Hood different from most film adaptations is not simply its darker tone. The movie appears to be drawing from the medieval death tradition associated with Robin Hood, depicting the final chapter of the outlaw's life rather than another origin story or heroic adventure. This alone places it much closer to the oldest surviving Robin Hood material than many of the famous adaptations that have come before it. The initial reaction from audiences and critics has been that the film is a bold reinterpretation of the character. My own reaction, so far, is the opposite. See, my hypothesis is that The Death of Robin Hood is not a reimagining at all. To me, it appears to be a correction. The reason this feels unfamiliar to modern audiences is because the popular image of Robin Hood has been shaped for over a century by later retellings, particularly by those influenced by Howard Pyle's The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood. Pyle's work helped transform Robin from a rough medieval outlaw into a romantic folk hero, paving the way for the version later popularized by American culture in the Errol Flynn classics. In other words, what many people are calling a reimagining may actually be the closest thing mainstream audiences have seen in decades to the Robin Hood that existed before the myth was Disneyfied. Now, before we can talk about whether The Death of Robin Hood is bringing the character back to his roots, we need to establish a very simple fact. Most of us don't actually know who Robin Hood was. And that's really not anybody's fault. That's the media. For over a century, the public has been fed a version of Robin Hood that has been filtered through Victorian writers, Hollywood producers, Disney executives, and people who genuinely seem uncomfortable with the idea of an outlaw who is actually an outlaw. One of the best resources I've found on the historical Robin Hood is boldoutlaw.com, which compiles and analyzes the medieval sources behind the legend. And when you actually start looking at those sources, a very different picture emerges from the one that most people know. So let's start with what is considered the oldest surviving Robin Hood origin story: Robin Hood's progress to Nottingham. This is not the story of a nobleman returning from the Crusades. This sure as hell is not the story of a rich lord who suddenly discovers compassion for the poor. And it sure as shit is not the story of a wealthy aristocrat deciding to become a social worker with a bow and arrow. In the story, Robin is a young yeoman traveling toward Nottingham when he encounters a group of foresters. An argument breaks out. Violence follows. Robin kills them. A lot of later versions try to soften this, and to be fair, Robin is acting in self-defense. But let's not pretend otherwise. The body count is still the body count. The ballad ends with the line, "and he buried them all in a row." That's not Errol Flynn. That's that's definitely not Disney. That's not some charming fox singing songs in Sherwood Forest. That's one of the earliest surviving ballads of Robin Hood. And things only get worse from there. After the killings, Robin is pursued by the authorities. In modern language, you could make a very strong argument that Robin's entire outlaw career begins as a result of what we would now recognize as police brutality and state overreach. A confrontation with armed representatives of authority escalates into violence. The state comes after him. Robin fights back. The outlaw is born. Now let's address a few myths. Robin Hood was not originally a rich man who found God. He was not originally a rich man who gave away his fortune. He was not originally an aristocrat who decided to fight on behalf of the common people. Those ideas emerged much later. They're fantasies created by people who are far more comfortable with the wealthy assisting the poor than they are with ordinary people fighting back against those same wealthy people. The medieval Robin Hood wasn't a nobleman descending from above to save the peasants. He was a yeoman, an outlaw, who operated outside the system entirely. And perhaps the biggest myth of all is the connection to King Richard the Lionheart. The earliest Robin Hood traditions didn't revolve around Richard. In fact, the Robin Hood stories existed before Richard became attached to the legend. The famous conflict between Robin, Prince John, and Richard the Lionheart is largely later added in. Traditionally, the king associated with Robin's world would have been Henry II, Richard's father. Think about what that actually means for a second. Richard would have grown up hearing these stories about this outlaw. He would have known the legends that he was soon to be a part of. And considering Robin's habit of humiliating royal officials, sheriffs, churchmen, and representatives of authority, it's safe to assume that Richard probably wouldn't have been a fan of Robin Hood. The Robin Hood most people know today is a later invention. The Robin Hood found in the oldest surviving ballads is rougher, more violent, more rebellious, and far less interested in asking for permission from the rich. Now let's talk about why almost every modern Robin Hood adaptation misses the point. And to understand that, we need to understand just how thoroughly Howard Pyle and Errol Flynn took over this character. Because once that happened, nobody was adapting the actual Robin Hood anymore. They were adapting adaptations of the character. Like take Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. To be fair, Kevin Costner, he actually seems to have been trying to move back towards something rougher and dirtier than the Disney version. At least there was an attempt to make the world feel medieval again. Now, the problem is they never escaped the trap, though. Robin is still a nobleman during this movie. He's still tied to the Crusades. He's still operating inside the framework built by Howard Pyle and Errol Flynn, rather than the ballads. The movie feels like it's trying to get back to the outlaw while refusing to let go of the aristocrat. And even Alan Rickman wasn't exactly shy about his opinion of the production. The man spent years making jokes about the film and openly talked about rewriting large portions of The Sheriff because he wasn't happy with what was on the page. And frankly, he's half the reason people still watch it. I mean, he's the only reason I watch it. Then after that, Robin Hood largely disappeared from the spotlight for a while, save for the Mel Brooks version. And then the BBC happened. See, now here's where I completely lose my mind. Like, England, you're the country that actually produced Robin Hood. You are the country that owns those ballads, okay? You're the country that has centuries of folklore surrounding this character. And then you looked at Robin Hood and said, you know what? Those Americans, they seem to have gotten it right. Magna Carta who? So what do we get? Robin is an aristocrat yet again. The Earl of Huntington. Robin goes to the Crusades. Robin comes home. Robin fights corruption. Robin falls in love with Marian again. It's the American version, literally. England, one for one, imported its own folk hero back from Hollywood. We stole their legend, rewrote it, exported it back across the Atlantic, and they just rolled with it. Like, no wonder that empire collapsed. Holy shit. Now, don't get me wrong. I actually do like the BBC show. It's it's really fun. I love it. It's successful. And I'm not the only one who still remembers it fondly today. But it is successful as an adaptation of the Americanized Robin Hood, not the medieval one. So then we can move forward to Russell Crowe, because then that version came along. And honestly, I think Ridley Scott got closer than most people realize. You see, the problem for me is that they still couldn't commit. As you're watching the Ridley Scott version, the movie wants the historical outlaw. It wants the ballads. You can feel it. The movie wants medieval politics, but it also wants the Errol Flynn story, the one everybody already knows. So instead of choosing one, it again tries to smash things together. The result is a Robin Hood movie that feels like it's fighting itself. It's half the ballad, half Hollywood, and 100% confused with its own identity. Then, somehow, Hollywood looked at decades of this and learned absolutely nothing. Enter Taron Egerton and Jamie Foxx. And once again, we are back to the same problem. Robin is rich. Robin is a nobleman. Robin comes from privilege. For fuck's sake! Like, he gets turned into a medieval action hero. And once again, the actual outlaw disappears. That movie bombed. Because at some point, audiences can tell when they're being sold the same thing over and over again. Looking at you, Marvel. What all these versions have in common is that they aren't interested in the Robin Hood from the oldest stories. The Robin Hood who kills. The Robin Hood who gets hunted by authority. The Robin Hood who starts as a yeoman outlaw, a common man. The Robin Hood who exists outside the system. Instead, they keep giving us this nobleman, aristocrats, crusaders, lords, earls, dukes, people who shouldn't be associated with the character, rich men with a social conscience. What a fantasy. That's not the character that shows up in the earliest ballads. That is the character that later generations invented because the real one made them uncomfortable. Which brings us back to the death of Robin Hood. Because for the first time in my lifetime, it looks like somebody finally remembered that Robin Hood wasn't supposed to be a lord pretending to be an outlaw. He was an outlaw. So all of this finally brings me to the movie itself, The Death of Robin Hood. And honestly, the biggest piece of evidence is sitting right there in the title. The Death of Robin Hood. Not Robin Hood Returns. Not Robin Hood Begins. Not Robin Hood and the Crusades again. Not Robin Hood Saves England. The filmmakers specifically chose one of the oldest surviving traditions as the foundation for their story. Robin Hood's death. Now, before anyone starts yelling at me in the comments, no, the movie is not out yet. I'm pre-recording this. We don't know exactly how closely it follows the ballad. I don't know what changes have been made. I don't know what liberties have been taken. But what I do know, what the filmmakers have chosen to focus on, which is important in storytelling, because the ballad known as The Death of Robin Hood is about exactly what it sounds like. Robin Hood is old. He is wounded. He is betrayed by those around him. Robin knows his end is approaching. This is not the story of a young man becoming a hero. It's the story of an outlaw confronting the consequences of the life he chose to live. That alone already puts it closer to the medieval tradition than most modern adaptations. Look at the public information that has been released so far. Like I said at the beginning of this video, Robin Hood is described as older. He's injured. He's reflecting upon his life. He's haunted by violence. And he's also questioning the stories that people are telling about him. One review even describes him as openly rejecting parts of the legend that grew around his name. Now, compare that to the earliest of ballads, like I've been describing. The medieval Robin Hood was never portrayed as a perfect hero. He was never portrayed as a saint. He's not a role model for children. He's violent. He's dangerous. He is an outlaw. And most importantly, he doesn't spend his time apologizing for being an outlaw. The oldest surviving Robin Hood stories are not about a nobleman discovering social justice. They're about a man living outside the law and surviving through skill, violence, loyalty, and sheer stubbornness. That appears to be much closer to what the movie is interested in. Notice what's missing from the marketing. No giant emphasis on the Crusades. Not once. There's no grand speeches about restoring the kingdom. No desperate attempts to convince us Robin is secretly an aristocrat. No Earl of Huntington nonsense. No rightful nobleman reclaiming his title. Instead, we're getting an aging outlaw looking back on a bloody life. And honestly, that's a hell of a lot closer to the ballads than what Hollywood has been feeding us for decades. Which is why I keep saying this movie is being mislabeled. People are calling it a reimagining of the character. It's not. I think it looks like a correction. A reimagining would be taking Robin Hood somewhere completely new, making him a space pirate. Ooh, I'd watch the shit out of that. Or maybe making him a cyberpunk hacker. Ooh, modernize the character. We can make him a vampire hunter. How about that? This isn't doing that, though. Hugh Jackman's version isn't doing that. This appears to be reaching backward instead of forward. Back past Disney. Back past the Errol Flynn version. Back past this Crusader mythology. Back past everything and toward the older outlaw traditions that existed before the character was cleaned up for modern audiences. Now, could the movie still screw this up? Oh, absolutely. It's Hollywood. I would expect nothing less. If the film suddenly reveals that Robin was secretly an aristocrat all along and starts lecturing us about restoring the kingdom and, spends time in the third act turning him into another sanitized Hollywood hero, then it will have missed the point just like so many adaptations before it. But if it commits to the version that the trailers, reviews, and promotional material are suggesting, if it gives us the aging yeoman outlaw, if it gives us the violence, the regret, the ambiguity, if it gives us a Robin Hood who feels like he stepped out of the ballads rather than out of the Disney vault, then this might be the closest thing in decades that we have seen to the Robin Hood that medieval audiences actually recognized. The Robin Hood I grew up reading about. And frankly, I think that's exactly why people like me are interested in this film. Because after a century of noblemen pretending to be outlaws, audiences might finally be ready for an actual fucking outlaw again. So let's get back to the original question of this entire rant. Is the death of Robin Hood a reimagining? No. If anything, it looks like the first major Robin Hood movie in decades that remembers who the fuck Robin Hood actually is. He is not an aristocrat. He is not a crusader. He's not an earl. He's not a nobleman slumming it in the forest for a few weekends before he returns to his castle. He ain't rich. He's the outlaw, the yeoman, the common man, the powerful wanted dead. And that right there, that's why Robin Hood matters. That's why this story matters. Not because it's an old story, not because it's a piece of English folklore, not because historians and chuds like me find it interesting. No, it's because the story never stopped being relevant. The rich keep trying to claim Robin Hood. They've been trying for a century. They turn him into a lord. They turn him into an earl. They turn him into a nobleman. They turn him into a rich guy helping poor people because that version is comfortable for them. That version is safe. That version tells us that salvation comes from above. The real Robin Hood tells us something far more dangerous. He tells us that people at the bottom are the ones that don't need permission from the rich. That's why the story survives. Robin Hood wasn't standing with the nobility, he was humiliating them. Robin Hood wasn't protecting the system, he was making the system look weak. Robin Hood wasn't asking power to behave better, he was taking power's lunch money and laughing while he did it. And the best part is that there is no one Robin Hood. There never was. There isn't some grave we can all just go and point to and go, yep, that's him right there. That's the bold outlaw of Barnsdale and Sherwood. He's under the ground. The legend is built from outlaws broadly, rebels, poachers, folk heroes, people who stood up when they were told to kneel. Robin Hood isn't one man. Robin Hood is an idea. That's why he survives. Because every generation creates him again. Every generation finds its own Sheriff of Nottingham. Every generation finds its own Prince John. Every generation finds its own group of rich bastards convinced the rules only apply to everyone else. And every generation creates new Robin Hoods to fight them. That's why the story matters and why it always will. The people standing in protest lines, the people protecting their neighbors from ICE, the people fighting surveillance and going after flock cameras, the people organizing unions, the people taking on the billionaires, the people refusing to back down when authority tells them to shut up and know their place. They are Robin Hood. We are Robin Hood. Not because we're wearing green tights, not because we're all running around carrying bows and arrows, but because we're doing exactly what Robin Hood has been doing for 700 years. Standing up, fighting back, refusing to kneel. That's why the legend survives when kingdoms didn't. That's why it survived kings, empires, and even Hollywood. Because Robin Hood doesn't belong to Disney. Robin Hood doesn't belong to Errol Flynn. He doesn't belong to Hollywood. And he sure as shit does not belong to the rich. Robin Hood belongs to us. He always has. And as long as there are people willing to stand up to power, that story always will matter. Because we are Robin Hood.